welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling, well, a really persistent and controversial topic.
Definitely.
The controlled demolition conspiracy theories about the World Trade Center collapse on 9/11.
It's one that just keeps coming up. So to help us unpack it, we're drawing on a couple of key sources.
Right.
We've got bits from a Europhysics news article looking at, the actual physics of how big buildings collapse.
It gives us that scientific angle.
Exactly. And then we've got a pretty detailed overview from Wikipedia, which lays out the demolition theories themselves, the arguments, the counter-arguments, the whole debate, really.
Okay, so our mission here is to try and understand what these theories are actually claiming, what the official responses were, and just kind of map out this whole ongoing discussion. We'll use the physics perspective and the broader story.
Sounds good.
All right, so let's start at the beginning. Where did this whole idea that explosives were involved actually come from? What's the basic premise?
Well, the core idea really is that the plane impacts and the fires that followed, they weren't enough on their own.
Not enough to cause that total collapse.
Right. Not for the Twin Towers and 7 World Trade Center. The argument is you needed something else. Specifically, pre-planted explosives to weaken the structures so they'd come down completely and quickly.
And the sources mentioned some key figures who pushed these ideas early on.
Yeah. People like Stephen E. Jones, he's a physicist, Richard Gage, an architect, Jim Hoffman, an engineer, and David Ray Griffin, a theologian. They were some of the first voices really saying, hang on.
Saying what exactly?
That the damage from the planes and the heat from the jet fuel, it just couldn't account for it, for these massive steel buildings to fail like that.
But the official investigations, like NIST, they saw it very differently.
Oh, absolutely. The National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, and you also see it detailed in places like Popular Mechanics, they looked into these demolition claims specifically, and they rejected them flat out. The consensus among structural engineers, the people who really know buildings, is that it was fire-induced, gravity-driven.
Fire-induced, gravity-driven. What does that mean in simple terms?
Basically, the fires burned really hot for a long time. This weakened the steel beams and columns, especially around the impact floors.
Okay.
Eventually, that weakened structure just couldn't hold the weight of the floors above it anymore.
Yep.
And gravity did the rest. One floor fails, pancaking onto the next, and you get this progressive collapse downward.
The gravity was the main force, just acting on a structure weakened by fire.
That's the established view, yes. And there are specific experts mentioned. Professors like Zdeněk Bouchant, he's a big name in structural mechanics, Thomas Eager from MIT, James Quintier, an expert in fire protection. They all looked at the evidence and dismissed the demolition idea. They support the fire and gravity model.
Structural mechanics. That's basically how buildings hold up under stress.
Pretty much, yeah. How forces and loads affect structures.
Okay. Now, a huge part of the demolition theories revolves around thermite, or this nanothermite stuff. What's the argument there?
So back in 2006, Stephen Jones suggested that thermite might have been used.
Thermite. That's the stuff that burns incredibly hot, right? Metal powder and metal oxide.
Exactly, burns super hot, or even super thermite, a more potent version. The idea was maybe someone with inside access planted it on key structural points.
To melt or weaken the steel beams.
That's the theory. And it led to this really controversial paper, didn't it, about finding nanothermite.
Ah, yes, the dust samples.
Right. In 2009, Jones, Niels Harrit, and some others published in the Open Chemical Physics Journal, they claimed they found actual nanothermite residue in dust from the WTC site.
And nanothermite is supposed to be even more powerful.
Yeah, the particles are tiny, nanoscale, so it reacts much faster, releases energy more quickly than regular thermite. That's the claim.
Sounds like a smoking gun, if true.
Yeah.
But wasn't there a big problem with that paper's publication?
Oh, absolutely. Huge controversy. The journal's editor-in-chief actually resigned over it. She said it was published without her even knowing about it, let alone approving it, which, raises serious questions about the peer review, the whole process.
Yeah, that definitely casts doubt. What did NIST say about these nanothermite claims?
Well, NIST was skeptical. They questioned the chain of custody for those dust samples.
Meaning they couldn't be sure where the dust actually came from or how it was handled.
Exactly. Without that clear history, you can't definitively tie it to the WTC collapse, they argued. It's interesting, though, Jones apparently offered NIST samples with a documented chain of custody for them to test themselves.
And did NIST take him up on that?
No. Apparently, they decided not to pursue that line of investigation with their own dust samples.
Okay. Another thing you hear about constantly is molten steel. That photo in the Europhysics article, is that related?
It touches on it, yeah. Demolition proponents, Jones included, point to videos and photos showing what looks like molten metal pouring out of the South Tower before it collapsed.
And the argument is fires can't melt steel.
Not jet fuel fires, they argue. Steel melts at, around 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit. They say the fires wouldn't get nearly that hot, so this molten material must be evidence of something like thermite, which produces molten iron.
But NIST had an answer for that, too.
They did. NIST concluded that what people were seeing was probably molten aluminum from the plane wreckage.
Aluminum melts at a much lower temperature.
Way lower, yeah. Around 1220 Fahrenheit. So molten aluminum wouldn't necessarily mean thermite was present.
Okay. What about testing thermite itself? Can it actually cut through those massive WTC columns?
Well, there was a test done by the Energetic Materials Research and Testing Center. They used regular thermite on a steel column. It couldn't cut through it. And the test column was apparently even smaller than the core columns in the WTC. So that raises questions about conventional thermite's effectiveness for this kind of demolition.
But again, the proponents would circle back to nanothermite, saying it's different.
Precisely. They argue nanothermite, with its faster energy release, could potentially do the job where regular thermite failed. That's the counter.
Let's shift a bit. The Wikipedia source talks about logistical problems with the whole controlled demolition idea. What are they?
This is a really big one. Think about it. Planting enough explosives to bring down those towers and building 7, we're talking huge amounts of material.
Right.
How do you get all that into highly secured buildings, plant it correctly without anyone noticing? Over weeks, maybe months, with thousands of people working there, it seems incredibly difficult logistically.
And the way the towers collapsed, from the top down, that's not how demolitions usually work, is it?
Generally, no. Controlled demolitions usually start at the bottom, cutting the supports there to bring the building down inwards. The WTC collapses started way up at the impact and fire zones.
Plus, wouldn't the explosives have needed to survive the plane hitting the building?
That's another massive challenge. Any device would have to be incredibly robust to withstand that kind of impact and fire without going off early or just being destroyed. Seems unlikely.
Okay, what about eyewitnesses? People reported hearing explosions, right?
Yes, that's definitely something groups like Scholars for 9/11 Truth emphasize. They've collected accounts of flashes, loud bangs, things that sounded like explosions right before the collapses.
Some videos even seem to capture loud sounds.
The International Center for 9/11 Studies points to specific moments in NIST videos where you hear these loud noises potentially correlating with collapse initiation.
But again, there are official counter-explanations for those sounds.
Yes. NIST and others argue that a massive building failure like this creates all sorts of loud, sharp noises. Giant steel beams snapping, concrete floors pancaking. That stuff makes a racket. It could easily be mistaken for explosion.
And the seismic evidence.
Yeah.
Earthquakes readings.
That's another key point. Seismographs nearby recorded the collapses, but they didn't show the kind of distinct, sharp spikes you'd typically expect from large underground or near-ground explosions used in demolitions.
What about those puffs of smoke?
Yeah.
The ones shooting out horizontally from the sides of the towers as they came down.
Yes. The squibs. Proponents point to those as clear evidence of explosive charges going off sequentially down the building, like in a controlled demolition.
And NIST's explanation for those.
NIST says it was air pressure. As the massive weight of the collapsing upper floors came down, it acted like a giant piston inside the building, especially in the elevator shafts.
Pushing air out.
Exactly, forcing air and dust out violently through any openings on lower floors, creating those puffs. They call it pancaking effect pressure.
Let's talk about Building 7, World Trade Center 7. This is often called the real smoking gun by theorists, isn't it?
It really is central to many theories, yes. A 47-story, steel-framed skyscraper, not hit by a plane, and yet it collapsed completely late in the afternoon on 9/11, symmetrically into its own footprint, pretty much.
And the fact the 9/11 Commission report barely mentioned it?
Or didn't mention it at all, depending on how you read it. And NIST took 7 years to issue their report on why it collapsed. That delay feeds suspicion.
So why do proponents think 7 WTC was brought down deliberately? What's the motive?
A few ideas get floated. Maybe it was some kind of operational command center for the whole event, or maybe certain tenants had sensitive files they wanted destroyed.
Who were the tenants?
Well, Dylan Avery, the loose change guy, highlighted tenants like a clandestine CIA office, the Secret Service, the SEC, the city's emergency command center. Stuff like that made it sound suspicious.
But didn't Richard Clarke push back on that?
Yeah, Richard Clarke, the counterterrorism advisor, basically said, look, it was commercial office space. Anyone could rent there. It wasn't necessarily sinister.
A key argument is also that no steel high-rise had ever collapsed solely from fire before 9/11.
That's a major point for proponents, absolutely. It was unprecedented at the time for a building like 7 WTC.
But have there been cases since?
Yes, and NIST points to these. The Plasco building in Tehran in 2017, the Wilton Pais de Almeida building in São Paulo in 2018. Both steel frame buildings that experienced total collapse due to fire, so it can happen.
And NIST also stresses that 7 WTC wasn't just on fire, right? It was hit by debris.
Crucial point. When the North Tower collapsed, huge amounts of debris rained down on 7 WTC, causing significant structural damage before the fires really took hold.
So what was NIST's final conclusion on Building 7? Why did they say it fell?
Their conclusion was fires. Uncontrolled fires burning for about 7 hours on multiple floors.
How did the fires cause the collapse?
They said the heat caused thermal expansion in the floor beams, which pushed a critical girder off its seat. This led to the failure of a key column, number 79.
And that started a chain reaction.
Exactly. Once that column went, it overloaded others, leading to a progressive collapse of the entire east penthouse, and then the whole building came down. They also noted the sprinklers weren't working effectively because the water mains were broken by the Twin Towers collapse. That was a big factor.
Progressive failure again. One thing leads to another.
That's the mechanism they described.
What about the BBC reporting the collapse early? That always comes up.
It does. BBC News reported it had collapsed about 20 minutes before it actually did. Conspiracy theorists point to this as proof of foreknowledge.
And the BBC's explanation.
They've always maintained it was an honest mistake. They were getting reports the building was critically damaged and about to collapse, confusion reigned, and the reporter, Jane Stanley, reported it prematurely based on agency wires, they say.
Then there's Larry Silverstein, the developer. The pull it comment.
Ah, yes. Silverstein leased the WTC complex. He recounted a conversation with the fire department command late that afternoon about Building 7. The fires were raging, it looked unstable.
And he said
something like, maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And then added, and they made that decision to pull, and we watched the building collapse.
Sounds damning to some.
It does, but Silverstein and his spokesperson clarified later. They said pull it was referring to pulling the firefighters out of the building for their own safety. Not pull as in demolish the building. It's firefighter terminology, apparently.
Okay. Now, NIST's investigation of Building 7, it relied mostly on videos and plans. Why not the debris itself?
That's a point of contention. Unlike the Twin Towers, where more steel was preserved, the debris from 7 WTC was removed and, well, disposed of relatively quickly.
Before a full forensic analysis could happen.
Essentially, yes. So NIST had to lean heavily on photos, videos, architectural drawings to figure out what happened. Critics say valuable physical evidence was lost.
Did NIST look for explosives in Building 7 specifically? Thermite?
They did consider it, but they concluded no blast event happened. They cited the lack of loud explosion sounds on a recording.
No boom.
No clear boom that they could identify as an explosion. And they argued planting the massive amount of thermite needed, undetected, was just highly improbable. They also ruled out diesel fuel fires alone causing it.
But wait, wasn't there another study more recently? From a university?
Yes, that's important. The University of Alaska Fairbanks, UAF, Professor J. Leroy Hulsey, led a multi-year study funded actually by architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth.
Okay, funded by a proponent group. What did they find?
They used computer modeling, finite element analysis, and their conclusion, published in 2019, I believe, was that fire, as described by NIST, could not have caused the total collapse of Building 7.
So what did cause it, according to them?
They concluded it had to be a near-simultaneous failure of every column in the building. Essentially, a global failure inconsistent with just fire.
Wow. That's a direct contradiction of NIST.
A very direct one. And importantly, Hulsey's team made all their computer models and data public so others could examine their work.
Okay, so the debate is clearly still alive. What about criticism aimed at the demolition theorists themselves?
Well, yeah. Stephen Jones, for instance. His own university, BYU, put him on leave and he eventually retired. The university mentioned the increasingly speculative and accusatory nature of his 9/11 work.
Did his colleagues support him?
No, the structural engineering faculty there actually put out a statement saying they didn't support his hypotheses. They distanced themselves.
And other experts weighed in critically, too.
Oh, yeah. Bechant called demolition proponents outsiders with a mistaken impression about building safety margins. Thomas Eager accused the movement of using a reverse scientific method, starting with the conclusion, then finding evidence.
What about the physical evidence, or lack thereof?
Brent Blanchard, who knows demolition, asked, where's all the thermite residue? During the massive cleanup, nobody reported finding tons of it. He also questioned the chain of custody for some steel beams proponents claimed tested positive.
Any other scientific critiques?
Dave Thomas, writing for Skeptical Inquirer, made a few points. One, the ingredients for thermite iron oxide, aluminum, are actually pretty common in building debris anyway. Two, thermite usually burns too slowly for the rapid destruction scene. And he mentioned a demo where nanothermite failed to cut a steel beam well.
Even Larry Silverstein hoped the NIST report would end the theories.
He did. He hoped it would provide closure. Clearly, it hasn't for everyone.
Because proponents like Richard Gage still argue the official story doesn't add up.
Exactly. Gage continues to question the investigation, especially regarding Building 7. He highlights things like NIST's lead investigator apparently saying he couldn't really explain why the skepticism persisted so strongly. Gage sees that as telling.
So, wrapping this up, we're left with two fundamentally different narratives.
Pretty much. You have the official explanation, fire-induced gravity-driven collapse, backed by NIST and the majority of the engineering community.
And on the other side?
You have the controlled demolition theories, fueled by observations like the collapse speed, the molten metal, Building 7 eyewitness accounts, and a deep distrust of the official findings. They argue anomalies haven't been adequately explained.
And despite official investigations finding no definitive evidence of explosive.
The proponents keep pointing to those anomalies, questioning the science, questioning the motives, keeping the debate alive. It shows how complex it is to analyze such a massive failure.
Absolutely. It's incredibly complex technically. It obviously carries immense emotional weight. It really does make you think.
Yeah.
Given all that, how do we best evaluate these competing explanations for something so catastrophic?
That's the question, isn't it? There's no easy answer.
Definitely food for thought. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.